Dear students, today we will be looking at C.R. Mackintosh and the rise of modernism. C.R. Mackintosh was one of the architects of the Art Nouveau movement, and he played a very major role in the later years of Art Nouveau, resulting in the rise of modernism, or what we find as the early buildings of modernism. So, continuing from where we left off last time when we were talking about the contribution of Antoni Gaudí and the whole concept of form finding, let us come to some of the other works that happened during this time. And like I said, the Art Nouveau movement was very widespread in Europe. It was not just confined to a few countries. For example, we find that also in Austria with the works of architects like J.M. Olbrich, who made this wonderful building called the Secession House, which has got a very strong central axial symmetry. And this building, if we try to compare it with the plans of buildings across the world during that time. For example, if we compare it with the plan of the crypt of Colonia Güell by Antoni Gaudí, which is based on the form of like an ant or an insect. Then we have the plan of the Secession House, which Secession House is very symmetrical, but it is also modern in the way long span space has been created. And parallelly with that, maybe about 10 years later, we have the Unity Temple done by Frank Lloyd Wright in America. And both these buildings are very important. Of course, Unity Temple had a much larger impact because it had a very strong, it was a very strong part of the overall chain of the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, and we will be studying this building in a slight more detail later. So, here we find a comparison of plans of these buildings built approximately the same time, and we find how architects are responding to the new changes that are coming in as a result of Industrial Revolution. The reason why we could have a form like what Gaudí has achieved or what Olbrich brought in or the kind of buildings that Wright had developed was because of the coming in of new construction technologies like the use of RCC and steel in construction, which made it possible to come up with very fluid forms or to come up with very long spans. So, here we have the interior of these three buildings. We have the interior of Colonia Güell, and as you can see, it is very organic, it is very literally organic. We have the Secession House, which is very clean, minimal space, and then we have the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and later on we will talk about these concepts of what is called as plasticity and continuity, how Wright started looking at buildings movement not only in the horizontal but also in the vertical direction, and how space should flow not only freely in the horizontal but also in the vertical direction. How he started coming up with the idea of cantilevered spaces and balconies in a larger space, light coming from above, etc. We will again reflect on these ideas later. When we come back to the Secession House, we find, as you can see in the plan, it is a very neat and tidy space, though it has a very strong axis, but it is a very modern space with very minimal architecture. It less speaks more in this building. You find this interior here and here. This view that you see here, this door that is, for example, is this door, and this picture has been taken in this direction. This view that you see here is one of the side aisles of this building, and light is captured from the top in both the Secession House as well as the Unity Temple. In the Unity Temple, we find here light being captured from here, from the top, right? And in the Secession House, in this model section that is given here, there were skylights given, and light was being captured again from the top. You can see here the glimpse of the skylight of the Secession House, and this section shows how light was coming in from the top in the Unity Temple, as well as Wright was also taking in light from skylights above the eye line. Now, if we compare interiors of buildings in modern architecture as they evolve, we find that these large column free spaces had started coming as a result of new structural systems like RCC and steel, and this has turned to be, or it happens to be, one of the major developments rising out of just pure structural technology. Again, I will make this point here that evolving structural technology, evolving material technology has been fundamental to changes that have happened in architecture. Architecture, again I will repeat, is not the driver of change. Architecture is driven by change. When change happens in materials, when change happens in structural systems, or even when change happens in economics of countries, or socio-cultural changes happen, architecture also starts evolving, and architecture then becomes a reflection of that change. That is why architecture is so important when we look back into history and try to understand a civilization, when we try to understand how a people were living in a given era, whether it was Egypt or Greece or Rome. It is through their architecture that we are able to understand their socio-cultural value systems, their religious beliefs, their economic systems that were in place. Many things we learn about these civilizations, about these peoples through their architecture. One day when people will turn back and look at our century and our times, they will understand a lot about us through our architecture. So architecture, though not driven by change, it is reflective of the change that is happening in society. It is reflective of the people that we are. Here in this, there is a great advantage for displays of artwork because of large column free spaces, and I will take you through the century. So if we have the Secession House, which happened in 1898 to 99, we have the amazing work which Mies van der Rohe did, probably the one who made the biggest contribution in both large span spaces and what I call as long span spaces, that is tall buildings, and he did one of the fundamental contributions in the modern times, and this building is the new National Gallery that he did in 1968. Then we have the new Starts Gallery by James Sterling in 1984. All of them are galleries, art galleries. All of them display this example of large span spaces. And then there were many other galleries in museums which reflect the same thing. All the way up from 1974, Sainsbury Centre in the UK by Norman Foster, Centre Pompidou in 1977, the Datong Art Museum in China, all the way now very close to our times in 2021. Then we have the Milwaukee Art Museum that we saw a lecture before by Santiago Calatrava. We have the Haider Aliyev Center by Zaha Hadid. We have the Tate Modern, which is an adaptive reuse building done by Herzog and de Miro, and we have the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain by Frank Gehry. So this was one part that we see that was happening, the large span space that came up in Vienna, the work of Joseph Marie Olbrich. Now let us come to what was called as mechanomorphic architecture. We have talked about biomorphic, zoomorphic, osteomorphic architecture. Biomorphic means derived from natural vegetal forms. Biomorphic, zoomorphic is from animal forms, and osteomorphic is bone structures. So those derivations most radically we have seen in the works of Antoni Gaudí. Mechanomorphic means architecture that is morphed or that is derived from machines. So late 18th and early 19th centuries, many elements were inspired by machinery and industrialization, and architects were influenced by these advancements that were happening as a result of the industrial revolution. The industrial age 1.0 was truly and firmly in place, and to incorporate these concepts and elements which is symbolic of industrial age became a kind of a trend in architecture. So we have, for example, the building that we will be looking at closely, which is the Glasgow School of Architecture by Mackintosh, and we have even buildings like the Postal Savings Bank by Otto Wagner. And here we find this is immense use of glass ceiling over the Postal Savings Bank. We find complete exposed steel columns even with rivets visible in them, and this entire roof that we have in glass has another glass roof above it, which actually is a pitched roof where the snow falls and it is taken, that bears the load of the snow and taken off, and then light filters through this ceiling into the main bank working area, and then again there are these glass tiles on the floor so that this natural light can somehow even flow beneath to the floors below it. And this is a very strong example of mechanomorphic derivation. One of the early buildings exhibiting the direct an use of steel in an exposed form, like steel column and rivets in their exposed form. Then we also have the building called the La Maison du Peuple in Brussels by Victor Horta from 1896 to 99, which is also a machine-like derivation of a building. And here we find this example of mechanomorphic architecture. It was the headquarters of the Belgian Workers' Party. It had offices, shops, a cafe and an auditorium. And the iron skeleton is a visible iron skeleton, and we've already seen that earlier in the 19th century when we have seen train sheds and exhibition buildings. If not on the outside, at least on the inside, the iron skeleton was visible. So here we have this. It reflects the influence of both the natural world, because we find these kind of curved or certain Art Nouveau like elements within the building, but it also shows the technological advances taking place. So we have steel members in the auditorium with rivets visible in them. So both these are being put together. We have come to a period in architecture in the Art Nouveau movement where lot of industrial materials are being used, industrial advancements are being projected in the building. We are seeing the use of exposed steel with exposed rivets, etc. But there is still a restraint because they are trying to convert that into some kind of artistic pieces. Later on in the 20th century, we find that this kind of conflict completely disappears, and architects start using steel as is without trying to convert that into some kind of an artistic element. So in Maison du Peuple, which is mechanomorphic architecture for you again, there is now what we find a growing harmony between the facade and the interior. One of the things that was problematic about Industrial Revolution architecture was that the exterior and interiors didn't really connect with each other. When we look at, for example, the St. Pancras station that I talked about earlier, we find the facade is a combination, it's an eclectic facade. It has Greek, it has classical members, it's got Gothic features, Renaissance features, etc., all incorporated within the facade. But when you go on the inside and you see the shed, you find that the shed is completely in iron. So it seems as if we are looking at two different buildings. There is a disconnect between the outside and the inside. But when we come to the Maison du Peuple, slowly and surely there is a connection between the outside and the inside. The building starts speaking the same language. On the outside also we see the building is machine-like, and on the inside there are these exposed steel members responding to the industrial age. So this building was actually built on a difficult site because it extended around a segment of circular space that you see here, and part of the way it was along two radial streets, and so the plan itself is totally asymmetrical. And now another building came up in 1970s which is called the Willis Faber Domus. Like I told you in the earlier lecture, I will continue to do this. I will continue to connect the buildings of an earlier period with the buildings of a later period, so that you can see how there is a connection in how the buildings have evolved, how the past buildings are connected with the buildings of today. In Willis Faber Domus, it reinforced the urban scape in which the building was present. In that, this building also had a very asymmetrical site, and the entire envelope of the building was along the asymmetrical site. It was a very free-form plan. It was a low-rise construction responding to the scale of the surrounding buildings. It was a very curved facade, and that was in relation to the kind of medieval street patterns that you are able to see here around the building. So it fitted in the urban context. By day, the glass reflects the surrounding old buildings. You can see that here. And by night, the building reveals itself. The building reveals its interiors to us, and this is that period, that era had come when the buildings were in complete glass envelopes. Even the in-between mullions, etc., had more or less disappeared, and it's a continuous glass facade reflecting the interiors. Moreover, over and beyond what I have told you, it was also an early example of energy conscious design It was a very deep plan. It had an insulated grass roof when the concept of green roof had not yet come in, but this building has a grass roof or a green roof, ensuring good thermal performance, and it was planned on a flexible 14 square meter structural grade. So this turned out to be one of the seminal buildings of that period, and it is part of the high-tech architecture group. This is the work of Norman Foster, so it falls within that purview, and we will reflect on this hopefully again in later lectures. Now, Maison du Peuple had the auditorium on the top floor for a very simple logical reason, that on the top floor we can have this large span and columns will not be interfering in between. And it is an example of exposed glass and steel with lighting interiors coming through the glass, filtering into the auditorium. And on the top floor it has a steel roof, and it has very thin infill screens because they are not carrying any load that is being carried by the structural system. It's a corrugated ceiling in order to control the reverberation, and the side galleries have also been hung from the roof truss. Now again, coming to later buildings, many modern auditoriums have now come up, and they are astounding in the way they are addressing the architectural question. They are very wonderfully and aesthetically designed. One of the early 1970s examples is of course the iconic Sydney Opera House. This is the auditorium of the Sydney Opera House. Then we have later on in the 1990s the Lucerne Culture and Congress Center in Lucerne in Switzerland, which was done by Art Nouveau. This is the auditorium. And then we have the Sages Gate set in 2004 by Norman Foster, which is an example of a single envelope glass enclosing the entire building, and this is the auditorium. Now these are just few examples of how modern auditoriums have come up in modern buildings. There are many examples of such large span spaces in auditoriums, and many more architects have done this kind of work. Now if we look at Sages Gate set a little more closely, like I said, it's an example of a single envelope design, and this you can see in the section is the glass envelope, which is in a very wavy form that is enclosing this entire space. And so when the building was constructed, it was constructed inside out. First the interiors were constructed, that is the concert halls, etc. Then the envelope was generated or constructed over it, and thus the envelope was completed, the exterior envelope was made on top of it. So the outer glass and steel shell is enclosing 3 concert halls, and it brings them together as one. This one single envelope encloses 3 concert halls, and it brings them together as one. This is a concept that we see repeatedly happening in modern airports, where there is a single envelope enclosing many facilities within it. Now coming back to the building that we want to focus on today, which is the Glasgow School of Art, or GSA, by C.R. Mackintosh. This is called the GSA Mackintosh building. The Glasgow School of Art is several buildings. This one was one designed by C.R. Mackintosh, and he was a prominent architect of the movement coming from Britain. Mackintosh's architectural masterpiece is the Glasgow School of Art, and it is a mechanomorphic interpretation. As you can see here, even when you see this example, it is very heavy looking building. It's made out of stone, but the structure of the building, it's an RCC structure, and then the stone is used as a cladding material. Why I say this is an RCC frame structure? Because of these very wide glass openings that have been provided, and therefore it points us to in the direction that the building has a frame structure. These immense use of glass in the facade is the library part of the building, and light is also filtering in from the top, and we will look at it. These are the drawings, and this is the 3D model or the 3D view of the building. So UG, PG and PhD courses are offered in architecture, fine art and design in GSA. And Art Nouveau features, when you observe closely, is the wrought iron gate here, and these wrought iron elements that are provided in front of the glass windows. And the entrance of the building, in fact the overall, the way the stone has been used in the building, it gives the resemblance of a castle. The entire facade at the entrance gives the resemblance similar to a castle, and the building has a very solid and very simple geometry in plain facade using stone and glass. Interiors are in wood, iron and glass. Now one thing that I want to talk about here is about the idea of asymmetry in symmetry in architecture. That means when you look at the overall building, it looks symmetrical, but when you look at the center part from where the central axis can be taken, in this part you suddenly find that Mackintosh breaks the symmetry. This entrance gate is not symmetrical. If you look at a closer picture here also, you find it is off center. He could have easily done it and made it completely symmetrical, but it creates a certain kind of interest in the building when this symmetry is suddenly broken. So you find that particularly in the Whitechapel Gallery by Townsend in 1901. You find here this building is perfectly symmetrical, but for this entrance of the building. He could have easily placed it at the center. Everything that you see in the top, this part, is perfectly symmetrical, and had he just shifted this in the center, he could have got a perfectly symmetrical building, but he breaks the symmetry by putting it on one side. Then Vana Venturi House by Robert Venturi, who was one of the early proponents of what came to be called as postmodernism, in 1964 designed this house for his mother, and here you find the overall building points towards symmetry. But when you start looking at it closely, he is breaking the symmetry. For example, the left and right are not same. The overall form is symmetrical, but the chimney has a member which is off center. The overall building is symmetrical, but there are these points of asymmetry within it. So this is called asymmetry in symmetry. I am pointing this out to you in the hope that these points will probably help you when you design your projects. So now another way of looking or think of architecture is when a building is perfectly symmetrical, like you find in the Taj Mahal, or it is perfectly asymmetrical like you find in Frank Gehry's building. Then you find symmetry, very strong symmetry in modern architecture also. Symmetry is not just confined to classical architecture or Egyptian architecture. We find that in the Bangladesh assembly called the Jatiya Sangsad Bhavan in Dhaka by Louis Kahn. We find that in the Louvre Pyramid in Paris by I.M. Pai. We find that in the TWA terminal in New York by Eros Narayan in 1962. In these buildings, whether they were in glass or they were in RCC, whatever the cladding material, they were all having very strong symmetry. Or we find symmetry even in skyscrapers. We find that in the Petronas Tower in Kuala Lumpur designed by Cesar Pelli. We find that in our own Lotus Temple in New Delhi by Fesbus Sabah. Or we find that even in the works of Santiago Calatrava in the IST building, the Florida Polytechnic by Santiago Calatrava. Now there are three ways in which we can put together, we can have perfect symmetry, we can have perfect asymmetry, we can have asymmetry within an overall symmetry. Now when we look at the plan of the GSA building, we find it's a modern rational plan. Suddenly in front of us is a plan that might be coming out of even our own design studios. Very simple, straightforward plan, and it is based on the building's function. So this is one of the early examples where architects have started keeping the function on priority over the form. Usually in the past, the form superseded the function. This change started happening when we started talking about neoclassical architecture. The change had already started coming in, and gradually it kept on penetrating into architecture, and now by the time 20th century arrived, it was taking very strong roots. The section reveals access to the different levels of the building, because the two roads on either side of the building, one road is really sloping downwards, and they have taken advantage of that, and we find the access at different levels into the building. There are many sources of light coming in directly from the glass facade that you see here, light coming in from skylights that you see here, and exterior walls having large windows to provide light for the art studios and the two-story library. The extension of the Glasgow School of Art was a building called the Siona Reed building, which was designed by Stephen Hall. Now, you see here in this particular picture, the building, the Siona Reed building, is not there. You see the Glasgow School of Art here, and this place, this is what it used to be. Now, in this picture, you find that this building has been put together here. This building has come up here. This is the Siona Reed building. Now, this was done by Stephen Hall, in addition to the Glasgow School of Art, and the design of the Siona Reed building I am discussing with you because I want to talk about the aspect of complement and contrast in architecture. When a building gets extended, when a building has an addition given to it, you can either complement it completely, you can contrast it completely, or you can have a building which is a mix of both. There is a certain complement to it and there is a certain contrast within it. Now, Stephen Hall himself has based his architecture on modernist principles, explorations of light, materiality, that is the use of materials in the way that he has done it in construction, and the overall spatial experience. He focuses on the concepts of sustainability and ecological sensitivity. For example, in this project that you see here, the linked hybrid project in Beijing in China in 2009. It's a mixed use complex. It's got 8 towers that are connected by these amazing sky bridges here, and this promotes interaction and community within the overall mixed use development. Stephen Hall also provided the extension of this museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum, the art block of it in Kansas in the US, and this is the existing building. This is the addition by Stephen Hall, and you can see this is made of complete translucent glass. It's not transparent, it's translucent, so light filters in at night like this, and it has got underground, innovative underground galleries also. So very interesting work, and I do hope that you will consider these names, you will look at these names again, go online and see the works, other architectural works of Stephen Hall. Coming back to the Siona Reed building, the number one thing that complements it with the original building by Mackintosh is the scale of the building. Not only the height of the two buildings is more or less same, the overall built mass of the building, of the original Mackintosh building and the Siona Reed building, is about the same mass along the same street on either side. These near identical masses have been placed. The contrast is the Mackintosh building can be said to be thin bones with thick skin. It has got a steel frame, I am sorry, not an RCC, but a steel frame clad in stone, whereas the Siona Reed building is thin bones with thin skin. It has got an RCC frame clad with a very, very thin skin on top of it, and that is how he has done it. And the interiors, Mackintosh's building is partitioned and very intimate. The Siona Reed building, on the other hand, is very open and it is more social. So you find the use of darker colors within the Mackintosh building makes it more intimate. You find the use of lighter colors and the feeling of much more lightness in the building, or the overall light penetration also is greater in the Siona Reed building. The complement is that both are taking advantage of high north light studios. So in the Mackintosh building, the north being on this side, light is being taken from here, the light is being taken from here, and in the Siona Reed building, away from the street which is in the front of both the buildings, it is taking light from this side into the building, the north light is coming in. And this concept of north lighting is now seen in many more buildings. For example, we find that in India, in the Chandigarh, the Sept Ahmedabad, these two pictures are of Sept Ahmedabad, in which the north lighting is provided, and we find that in the Chandigarh College of Architecture also. The contrast is in the materiality. Materiality is the concept of selection and application of different materials in the construction of a building. Here in the Siona Reed building, he uses light and translucent materials versus heavy masonry used in the Mackintosh building. Now, there is tremendous transparency in both the buildings. There is transparency in the GSA in the way that it brings in a lot of light inside the building. That kind of bringing in a lot of light into the building continues in the Siona Reed. Mackintosh's manipulation of the building section for light is an idea that has also inspired Hall's Siona Reed, and he also manipulates the section of the building to pull in maximum natural light. Another idea that GSA uses to pull in light is the use of a light shaft that you see in the center of the building. There are in fact not just one, there are, as you can see in the plan, there are 3 such light shafts that have been provided, in which natural light comes deep into the building, and it also aids in vertical air circulation through the building and cuts down the need for air conditioning. This concept of a light shaft is also seen in the Sendai mediathek, and it is used in this project, which was done in 2001, in a much more complex way. The tubes here, these light shafts, are actually tubes which are also these supporting vertical members of the building, and these tubes act as light wells. They are also used for providing vertical circulation through staircases or even elevators, so that you can use them for vertical circulation of people, we can use it for bringing in both light and air into the building. So what it has in fact is it's got these 13 vertical tubes contrasting from one another, asymmetrically placed structural members. These tubes they are actually the column supports of the building, and they have different dias and are used for different functions. So the light is also entering into the Sendai mediathek through these vertical tubes, as you can see here, and the elevator shafts also work as light wells. One more thing about this building is that it has got varying floor heights. It doesn't have the same height. This was supposed to be, now what is a mediathek? Let's look at that. It initially began with the idea of building a library, but then they realized that now libraries are not only about books, libraries also about multimedia. Therefore, they came up with the idea of having a mediathek in which it will not just be books, but varying medias and videos and digital libraries, etc., all put together in this one building to be used by the people. And based on the function, different levels have different functions. The heights of these different levels is also varying. How did they achieve that is very interesting. This is one of the most innovative structural buildings that we find in the 21st century. It is in fact a new model for a future architecture, because the structural system in fact is minimal. It is a system of tubes and plates. The structural load is being carried by these what I termed as light shafts in the Siona Reed building, light tubes here. So these tubular steel columns not only are working for bringing in light or vertical transportation, but they are actually the steel columns of the building. Now how does it work? It's based on the concept, a simple concept of skewering. In skewering, if you have ever seen how kebabs are made, whether in any form of kebabs, you find that there is what is called there is an iron rod that is called as, it's used for what is called as skewering. You skewer, or you keep on adding the pieces of the material, eating material on the iron rod like that, and when you have the rod, you keep on piercing the material like that. You keep on piercing the material one after another like that, and then you cook it. This skewer is a thin metal or wooden stick which is used to hold these small pieces of food together. Now in the Sanda Mediathek, this is what they have done. They have taken these columns and they have skewered the floors of it. So now when you are skewering the floors, you can decide to keep the height of the floors different. Based on where you want to have the floor, you can skewer it there, right. So each floor, the tubes are supporting these plates integrally and penetrate each floor vertically. So this kind of structural system is not having columns supporting a slab and then the column continues in supporting a slab. This actually has columns running through and through supporting slabs which are also at varying heights from one another. Very interesting system. I have told you in a very simple way. The engineer behind it is one Sasaki, and I would like you to go online, you can read that paper, because this was a very complicated structural system that Ito had thought of, and Sasaki was able to implement his idea into this building. It has got a honeycomb steel floor plate which is relatively thin and is able to take the long span of the building. The glass skin is wrapped around the entire building which is suspended from these floor plates, and it has also got an earthquake energy absorbing system in the basement. This is one of the most futuristic buildings, or one of the more futuristic buildings that have come up in terms of the structural innovation it has brought into the 21st century. Coming back to the Siona Reed building and GSA, we find that they both exhibit sustainable design, whereas the earlier building had rather the Siona Reed building has incorporated green landscape, storm water management, natural ventilation is already there, and it has also built in a new biomass plant which is being used, and it is connected both to the older GSA building and to the Siona Reed building. Now coming to the Perkersdorf Sanatorium, I am talking in continuity about mechanomorphic architecture and how it was leading on to the early buildings of modernism. I was focusing mainly on C.R. Mackintosh and the GSA building and how it was emblematic of the change, the radical change that had come in through the Art Nouveau movement, using of natural forms, etc. The Art Nouveau movement lasted a very short time, 1890 to 1910. The use of natural forms, like the way Victor Horta has used them and more radically how Gaudi had used them, that also more or less disappeared after 1910. But what remained from the Art Nouveau movement was this mechanomorphic derivation. All those changes that happened in Art Nouveau were ultimately leading to buildings like this, the Perkersdorf Sanatorium in Austria by Joseph Hoffmann. It is closer to the modernist buildings of the early 20th century and paved the way for modern architecture. It is revolutionary because of the clarity in the facade. It is devoid of all ornamentation. It has got a very simple RCC construction. There is both simplicity in elevation and the interior spaces. There are some points, some elements related to Art Nouveau architecture in the interiors, but in general it is a very modern looking building, as I would put it. And then sanatorium that Joseph Hoffmann, the other sanatoriums came up in the 20th century like the Pioneer Sanatorium and the Zuba Sanatorium in Crimea and the Lavore Pavilion, Bexhill by the Sea in the UK in 1935. Now these sanatoriums that came up were because of diseases like tuberculosis, which did not have a cure at that time, and the people needed to be isolated in a remote area with a lot of natural landscape around it, where they could recover through fresh air, etc. Over time, the need for the sanatoriums disappeared because of new treatments that came in. Tuberculosis was no more needed to be isolated. Therefore, buildings like the Pioneer Sanatorium have now taken on other purposes over time, but the buildings still exist. The change that I was talking about in the interiors, let us review that change through this slide. This is how the interiors looked in the Baroque period. As you move on to neoclassical period, you find the interiors are becoming more restrained. There is ornamentation, but it is more controlled. As you move on from there to the Art Nouveau movement, you get ornamentation which is based on natural features, and then you move on to the later half of Art Nouveau and you find even that disappears and the building becomes more or less unornamented both inside and outside. When we find that change then happening when modernism came in, how tremendously different the buildings became. This is called the Stahl House by Pierre Koenig, and this was in Los Angeles. This is the Ames House by Charles Ames. This is the Falling Water by Wright, and this is the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier. So how modernist spaces became so unornamented, plain, with free flowing plans. And these are a part of late modernism. This I believe is the Smith House by Richard Meyer. This is Richard Rogers' own house. This is a building, a house done by Shigeru Ban in Japan, and he uses some kind of a poly material on the outside, and he comes up with radical ideas like the rooms are on rollers and you can actually bring them out, you can take them in. It's a very radical concept, and hopefully we will come back to this house again. And this is a house done by Rem Koolhaas, and hopefully we will look at some of these examples in a slightly more detail later. Modernism thus was getting firmly established in the early years of the 20th century. What is modernism? It is the rejection of traditional forms and adoption of new technologies and materials. It is the use of industrial materials like steel and concrete, and with the fundamental concept given to us by Louis Sullivan, who said form ever follows function, or reduced to the simple dictum in modern times, form follows function. There is simplicity with clean lines and clean and geometric shapes which are unornamented and plain facades, whether we have the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe in Barcelona in 1928, the Ingol's Ice Ring by Eero Saarinen in 1958, Glass House by Philip Johnson in 1949, the Guggenheim Museum by F.L. Wright in 1959. All these buildings are a part of modernism. Modern buildings' forms and appearance expressed their potential of materials and structural engineering. They were willing to express the building's structure right in front and not to cover it up with aesthetics and ornamentation. The modernism masters are Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, or even architects which came later like Richard Neutra, Richard Meyer, J.G.P. Aud and Philip Johnson, or even Eero Saarinen, Kenzo Tange, Tadao Ando and Pierre Koenig. These are some of the names of some of the iconic masters of modernism. We will end with this, and we will again come back and we will again talk. Now the next presentation we will talk about the rise of the skyscraper in the Chicago School movement, and we will, that movement, the Chicago School movement, ran more or less parallelly with the Art Nouveau movement in Europe, and how it led to the evolution of the modern skyscraper. By completing that presentation, we would have reached somewhere around 1900, 1910, both in Europe and in America. Then we will start on from there and step into the world of modernism and talk about some of the modernist architects. But before that, what we will do is we will begin that study by looking at 4 important architects. We will look at the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, whose works began around 1893 and then all the way into the 20th century. We will look at Mies van der Rohe, look at Le Corbusier, and we look at the contributions of Walter Gropius, the 4 great masters of modernism, and then we will take on our architectural study from there. And thank you so much for joining today.